Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Mary Roberts, who is the John Schaefer Professor of Art History at the University of Sydney. Yes, indeed, Sydney in Australia, where it is currently, I believe, 7 a.m., 8 a.m., 8 a.m. So she's woken up nice and early to speak with us today, and we greatly appreciate it. She's known to many of us in the Hudson Valley Berkshires region from a period when she was also a visiting faculty member at nearby Williams College, and I know we have a number of folks from Williams joining us today. She has been, as I mentioned, thinking about Olana in an international context that will be really helpful for our work. All of us who love this place, coming to understand it as not an isolated anomaly, but as a symptom of much wider cultural currents. Her particular expertise is in 19th century European Orientalist and late Ottoman art, and has a particular expertise in the history of artistic exchanges and the culture of travel. She's been incredibly prolific, particularly in the book department. I don't know the last time I saw a scholar who has been so productive in terms of books. So we've got Istanbul Exchanges, Ottomans, Orientalists, and 19th century visual culture in 2015. Also Intimate Outsiders, the Harem in Ottoman Orientalist art and travel literature. She's had a host of fellowships from the Getty, the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts, the Yale Center for British Art, from which I know we have one representative tuning in today. And her next book, you'll see a certain connection here, is on artists as collectors of Islamic art. So she's been spending a lot of time doing research in our collections at Olana. We'd hope to get her back in March to dive into the historic library of Olana. And we'll be ready when she is and when global events permit to continue this research project on our collection. So please do turn on your camera and join us, Mary. And we look forward to hearing your perspective on Sightlines on the Hudson. There we are, I see you. And let's see if we can hear you as well. There we go, great.
Great. Look, thank you, Will, for such a generous introduction. It is a pleasure to be speaking with this community of supporters of Olana, and I know I'm preaching to the choir in this company when I say that Olana is a unique place because of the house and its beautiful grounds, but also because of the collections related to Church's work creating it. It's an exciting and dauntingly large corpus of materials. The talk that I'm presenting this morning, is one of the chapters in my forthcoming book, which is a comparative international study of 19th century Orientalist interiors. What I'm presenting to you tonight is based on holdings at Olana, the Bureau of Historic Site and Park Services at Peebles Island, and the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. Before I commence this talk, I just want to express particular thanks to colleagues at each of these venues who have shared their knowledge and their passion for Frederic Church and Olana. Sean Sawyer, Mark Brzezowski, Ida Breer, Will Coleman at Olana, Michelle Phillips, Chris Flagg, Travis Bowman, and all the colleagues at Peebles Island. There are many others of you to whom I'm indebted who've joined us for this talk, and it's wonderful to see colleagues from Williamstown, LA, London, Chicago, Sydney, and Brisbane. So let's start with a quote from Church himself, written in 1869. About an hour this side of Albany is the centre of the world. I own it. What kind of world is this? When Frederic Church penned these lines to his countryman and fellow artist Erastus Dow Palmer, this man of the world had just returned from an extended trip to the cultural capitals of Europe and many of the renowned sites of ancient culture around the Mediterranean. His Mediterranean itinerary included Italy, Greece, and the Ottoman Empire, in particular Syria, Jerusalem, and the empire's capital, Istanbul. Church was well aware of the peripheral status of his local art world, but his bold claim to Palmer is earnest, not ironic. He spent the next 3 decades reshaping this land on the Hudson into the centre of his world. It was a process he famously described as landscape architecturing, and his Orientalist house was part of this all-consuming work in progress. This was a world he was both accruing and creating. The collections Church formed of costumes, photographs, and objects, many purchased during his extensive international travels, were crucial to his project and provide us with significant clues as to his process and to the multiple geographies of Church's world. This interior is dense with objects whose narratives lie within and beyond this world on the Hudson that Church was creating. In the literature on Olana, Church's collections have been conceived as souvenirs of travel and his ornamented interior an Orientalism that was distinct from the project of creating his patch of American landscape. In this paper, I will explore the way that Church's landscaping and his Orientalist interior are entangled through an aesthetics of framing along three key sightlines within the house. Church's Orientalist dwelling is experientially framed by and enfolded into his landscape that is orchestrated around an experience of travel. The visitor moved along carriage roads that Church created around the property, progressively arriving at a series of vantage points where they encounter views towards the house on the hill and away from it to the surrounding landscape within and beyond the boundaries of Church's extensive property. Visitors travelled around the property on white donkeys from Syria, replicating Isabel and Frederic's experiences in Beirut and Damascus in 1868. For Frederic and Isabel, the iterative process of this riding through the landscape must have invoked those memories and physically inscribed them into this landscape on the Hudson. Landscape is pictorialized in a range of different ways at the varied stopping points on this journey. From the site of Church's first studio, the lake he created on the property forms visual interest in the midground, while the Hudson and distant mountains are constituted as a background. Travelling to the southern side of Church's lake, a view of the house is framed by the foliage of his forest glade. Densely planted areas such as this glade open out elsewhere onto meadows and expansive views across the Hudson. These are, as art historian Jennifer Raab puts it, the multiple narratives of the picturesque landscape, an aesthetics of unlimited complexity informed by an ecological impulse that made it simultaneously an act of creation and preservation. The work of making this landscape involved planting over 1,000 trees on cleared land, digging out the swamp to create the lake, and excavating a cliff. It was a project that absorbed Church for over 30 years. In her compelling analysis of this landscaping, Raab connects this late work to Church's earlier monumental landscape paintings, seeing his immersive earth art, produced in a period when he's no longer enjoying the dizzying heights of his earlier professional successes, as at once a defense of his body of work and a release from its waning legacy. It's a project that transformed an optical experience of landscape into an experiential one of its physical creation that is nonetheless motivated by the same aesthetic concern, the challenge of reconciling detail with the whole. But this time, that landscape has to contend with and attempt to mediate the ever-changing effects of the natural world. Church's Persian-inspired home is a significant, perhaps one could say the significant detail within this landscape. The home, built in two stages, is a stylistic fusion of French Second Empire style and Italian villa that has structural and ornamental features derived from myriad Near Eastern sources. The view of the house varies dramatically depending on one's location on the property, the time of day and the season. From a distance, its colourful ornament recedes entirely. Up close, its honey-coloured local stone more readily blends into the landscape in fall, and at various times of day, the gilded pattern and highly glazed tiles cause these surfaces to shimmer. As one approaches the house, the experience of looking towards the dwelling and out towards the surrounding landscape is intensified. The house is screened from view by foliage and dramatically revealed a number of times before we arrive at the building's southeast corner and a spectacular view of the Hudson. The process of visually framing and assimilating a series of views and physical environments in Church's landscape continues once we're inside the house. This time, the framing is enacted by Persian arches that shape most of the apertures within the building. In the main room, significant sightlines are established as the viewer pivots 180 degrees from the Hudson to focal points within each room. It's an immersive experience that embeds Church's American landscape and his Orientalist interior. 3 of these sightlines in the house reveal the particular grammar of this American Orientalism: the sitting room and the court hall downstairs, and the guest bedroom upstairs. Just as Church laboured to create his landscape, he also spent many years designing and installing the ornament and objects in his home, in a process that synthesised his experiences in the world into his world on the Hudson. The aesthetics of this space, I contend, is governed by relationships between details and fragments. The capacity for individual elements in this house to act as a detail or a fragment rarely inhere in specific ornaments or objects themselves. Instead, these designations are constituted relationally. Church's paintings, trophies of arms, and even architectural fragments from other places became details within Church's composition, part of his world on the Hudson. Others disrupted such incorporation into his Gesamtkunstwerk, his total work of art, through metonymic relationships to other places, other worlds. So let's start with a sightline in the sitting room with Church's painting El Khasné Petra, the only one of his monumental Near Eastern landscapes that remained in his possession. It is the focal point of this room's sightline. A souvenir of travel gifted to Isabel, it rendered the tomb called Al Khasné that was carved into the sandstone rock face in the 1st century AD at Petra. Church refers to it as a temple, whereas the Arabic name Al Khasné means treasure house, but it was actually a mausoleum. In Church's journal, his experience of Al Khasné at Petra is embedded within an account of travelling rough through Bedouin lands, travel that is fraught with danger and physical vulnerability for Church and his 2 missionary companions. In the painting, this journeying is presented in the shadowy form of 2 armed Bedouin on the lower left. But on the walls at Olana, art recasts the vulnerability of the traveller's peripatetic dwelling in inhospitable lands into a reassuring ornamental beauty. The journey to Petra, a return journey from Beirut, was the most arduous of Church's trip, entailing an overland trek by horse and camel. Church translated this experience into word and image. It was the only part of his 19-month trip in which he wrote a daily journal. Church's journey has often been construed as a religious pilgrimage. He certainly makes a few mentions of biblical verse related to places visited, but the journal is far more preoccupied with his aesthetic experience, the exigencies of contemporary life in Syria, and the logistics of his journeying. This text reveals Church's increasing sense of latent danger from Bedouin tribesmen, the closer the travelling party got to Petra in this relatively remote region of the Ottoman Empire. While travelling, Church made visual annotations of costumes, faces, landscape views, and ancient sites. They accrue as conjunctions of visual intensity on his sketchbook pages, and these are the sketches held in the Cooper Hewitt Museum. His travelling party progressed daily through rugged terrain, staying in huts when there was torrential rain, but most often Church and his companions slept in the tents that they carried with them. His drawings distill the intensities of his response to this trekking and temporary dwelling. On the top right of this sketchbook page, Church has drawn a spear driven into the ground, marking the temporary land claim of one campsite. Near it, Church writes, "Shays horse and spear, sign of encampment." A sinuous line, punctuated with tiny pencil marks, arcs across this page, terminating near the spear. This visual shorthand is a distant landscape, and near it, Church has written, "Camels on mountainside." The detailed sketches of a crouching camel on the left and 2 versions of the chaise horse on the right suggest that this landscape annotation is an imagined view of his own travelling party traversing a distant hill. This condensation of near and far, mobility through the landscape and temporary dwelling, is rendered under the sign of the chaise authority. Church and his 2 companions depended upon him for their travelling party's safe passage because he was respected by the Petra tribes. The drawing on the reverse side of this same page reiterates these rhythms of temporary dwelling and travelling, but more intimately. Again, there's a potency created through impossible conjunctions on Church's sketchbook page. To the left of centre, Church has depicted the process of raising the tent, this time specifying a date, February 18, 1868. One of the travelling party is securing the guy ropes, work in progress, and there's a fragile beauty to the bunched and billowing fabric of this tent. The fragile skin of this dwelling is striking to other Orientalist encampment images, such as John Frederick Lewis's iconic A Frank Encampment in the Desert of Mount Sinai, 1842, with its self-assured, taut structure. On Church's page, one of the guy ropes transitions into a line contouring the neck of a bellowing camel that lies perpendicular to this tent. Underscoring motion and menace, a bird of prey, a hawk, glides through this part of the page. February 18 was the first day Church rode a camel, and he captures this unsteady experience in his diary. Soon after starting, my Arab flung me the leading rope, and then I was afloat on the ship of the desert. The motion was peculiar, exactly like that of a rocking horse, compelling an involuntary bowing of the body. So we sailed along like a trio of nodding mandarins. The motion causes seasickness in many, as I could readily understand from my own sensations. Church underscored the inexperienced rider's subjection to the will of their camels, recounting moments when entire bundles of their possessions and one among their party was jettisoned from his camel. He writes, "Fowler was pitched over his camel, head sprawling, to the infinite amusement of the Arabs, who chuckled over it in great glee for an hour afterwards. This event was evidently comical for his guides as they observed these novices attempting a task that was habitual to them. But for Church, this was alienating laughter." During this journey, Church's tent was a refuge, but a vulnerable one. At night, their valuables were all placed in the centre of their temporary domicile for safekeeping. Recording his siege mentality, Church writes, "Mikhail, our dragoman, our translator, keeps the Bedouin out of our tent, but he's obliged to have them all about his. My trunk is carefully laid out in the centre of my tent, and all precautions made to prevent pilfering." This tent was also a protective veil from which to sketch. Church was deeply ambivalent about his Bedouin guides, writing with racist condescension that they're like children in their unreasonableness and like wild beasts in other respects. They look upon travellers as prey. But the artist was also acutely aware how dependent he was upon their skill and local knowledge for safe passage across these lands. Despite the ongoing daily proximities of their journeying, this was a community of men among whom he was an outsider. Travelling with them was an awkward proximity that fostered an uneasy sense that he was out of place. This ambivalence is transmuted into an aesthetic intensity in his campfire scenes. On the evening of the 18th, the campfire of his Bedouin guides entranced Church. He wrote, "Just stepping out to see the splendid night pictures. Never saw so picturesque a scene as these Arabs sitting by the campfire, smoking, and the camels lying close by, also enjoying the warmth and chewing their cuds. Their huge forms look still huger in the vague light." This enchanted description is interwoven with an account of a dispute earlier that day between his translator Mikhail and the sheikh, a power struggle that demonstrates the Shah has the upper hand as a respected authority in these lands. Church's respect for the Bedouin elder increases as their journey progresses, but there's a lingering sense of unease and vulnerability. In this sketch, the artist renders the luminous force of night shadows in a blanket of pencil hatchings and deeply incised linear silhouettes, depicting a circle of Arabs and camels illuminated by campfire. As if uncertain that these pencil markings have sufficiently captured the atmosphere of the encampment, Church annotates this drawing with the following comment: "Splendid effect, campfire of Arabs, camels looming in the light, main figure brilliantly illuminated." This campfire scene is accompanied by a grid of small studies of camels and Arabs on the right side of the page. The most dramatic among them is a haunting image fragment. It's an aperture of particular visual ferocity. A Bedouin with one eye in shadowy blindness, while the other eye holds an intense interrogative stare. Church's accompanying annotation helped him recreate this visual memory into an oil sketch. Recollect dazzling white of eye, night scene. Again, we see the shine of that menacing eye that projects danger out of the darkness. This haunted aesthetic is a distillation of Church's unsettling experience. A few days later, his travelling party arrived at Petra. Church was awed by the edifice of Khasné that was dramatically visible through the Sikh, a dark, narrow gorge he described as wild scenery, overhung by lofty, ragged precipices, at the bottom of which was the tortuous road through which he and his party journeyed. His description attempts to render the subtle gradations of colour that he would later render in paint, the beautiful pale reddish salmon of the edifice hewn from rock, and the various shades of blacks, olives, and greys of the gorge's undisturbed geological formation. It's wonderful to see so lovely and luminous a colour blazing out of the stern, black, frightful rocks, he writes. Behold the beautiful temple, rich in sculpted ornament, shining as if by its own internal light. When he came to paint this edifice, Church evoked this sublime experience through dramatic contrast between the radiant colours of the classical edifice emerging through the thin opening in this dark crevice, and the exigencies of the trek are both invoked and eclipsed in the shadowy presence of two armed Bedouin in the foreground. Instead of travelling down the crevice following the implied directional movement toward El Khasné of the spectator and the painting's absent travelling party, these two Bedouin instead emerge from the shadows, guns at the ready, poised on the alert, confronting the viewer. The placement of the Petra painting in the sitting room at Olana both invokes and tames these memories of the journey through an ornamental incorporation of the artwork within the room. Like his tent, Olana is a place from which to see the landscape. The Petra painting is installed in the sitting room across from a magnificent view of the Hudson that is framed by a Persian arch. Under daylight, in this location, the two Bedouin disappear entirely, erased by the surface glare produced in this dark part of the canvas. Under these conditions, the subtle colouring of the two receding rock faces become a flat border nested within a series of ornamental borders within the room. The Moorish geometric pattern of the painting's gilded frame is in turn framed by the running pattern of faux Persian script cartouches interlaced with floral patterning that edge the upper and lower parts of these walls and all of the apertures within the room. This nested ornamental framing is matched by an effect of dispersed colour, as the subtle vocabulary of radiant colours on the tomb's facade are echoed in a similar palette across the room. First by the pink stone of the fireplace, whose insistent symmetry asserts its equal visual prominence below the painting. Church's vertical landscape, without the deep recessional space of the background that would draw us into the work, instead radiates its mysterious internal luminosity out towards the viewer. The vista out the window opposite is also framed into a vertical landscape by its aperture, but with the deep space of the Hudson River in the distance. For the occupant of this small room, this vista takes prominence, but it too is moderated by its framing Persian arch, whose amber glass border, under the right climatic conditions, turns the Hudson light into shards of colour that are unpredictably thrown around the room. In Church's sitting room, his Petra painting becomes a central detail within the ornamental and optical logic of his room. Orientalist architecture frames Church's landscape, and that landscape in turn activates the exotic artifice of his interior. But Olana's recuperative aesthetic is fragile. The most complex of Church's ornamental and optical configurations, the second sightline I'm analysing this evening, is in the court hall, the room at the centre of Church's home. The initial plan was that this room, with its four main openings, would be surmounted by a dome that filtered light from above. This would have created a multifocal effect in the room. These plans were modified because of the need to build a second story, and what resulted intensified the room's main sightline. At one end, a panoramic view of the Hudson, framed by the Persian arch of the Ombre. At the other end, a view of the stairwell leading up to the second level. A raised platform at this end of the room is framed either side by quilem portières. Like a proscenium arch, it draws the eye towards its highly ornamented configuration of carefully placed objects and crafted decorative surfaces. In this space, Church orchestrated a layered series of optical effects through the placement of objects and through stenciled, carved, and inlaid ornament. This distilled and accrued ornamental Orientalism is an imaginative geography derived from multiple sources. As in the first sightline in his sitting room, Church's writings and drawings reveal the stages by which the artist translated his experiences in the world into his world at Olana. And like the Petra sightline, Church's process is articulated through metaphors of travel. Church described the challenges and pleasures of creating his home in a letter to artist John Ferguson Weir, penned on the 8th of June, 1871. He writes that his building project, a feudal castle under the modest name of a dwelling house, absorbs all my time and attention. Church articulates the vicissitudes of imagining and translating Persian architecture into his home on the Hudson in the following terms. I'm obliged to watch it so closely, for having undertaken to get my architecture from Persia, where I've never been, nor any of my friends either, I'm obliged to imagine Persian architecture, then embody it on paper and explain it to a lot of mechanics whose ideal of architecture is wrapped up in felicitous recollections of a successful brick schoolhouse or a meeting house or jail. Here the artist voices the particular challenges for the provincial orientalist, who sees himself as a worldly artist instructing workmen in his local community in the northeast, whose building vocabulary is constrained to austere functional structures of incarceration, educational institutions, and Quaker meeting houses. Yet this process of translating exotic foreign architectural forms for local workmen was not without its pleasures, and Church articulates these in a lyrical itinerant metaphor. I enjoy this being afloat on a vast ocean, paddling along in the dreamy belief that I shall reach the desired port in due time. The collection of hundreds of Church's working drawings, tracings, oil sketches, and stencils for his house, now in the archive at Peebles Island, are the physical remnants of these artistic experiments when Church was adrift, working to derive his Persian home from diverse sources. Although he characterised it as a Persian interior, in fact, Church derived ideas from a much broader range of Near Eastern cultures that also include Mamluk, Moorish, and Armenian sources that he freely adapted to his purposes. Church's archive contains photographs of Damascus interiors, the Alhambra Palace in Granada, and Persian architecture, but his ornamental patterns were primarily derived from his library of printed books. Lockwood de Forest recalled the many evenings in which Church pored over these books. Comparing Church's drawings with these print sources reveals a diverse range of translations, from sacred to secular structures, and from palatial to bourgeois domestic architecture. At times, Church worked from ornamental books that had already translated volumetric forms into flat patterning on the printed page, and Church in turn commuted these into his own volumetric architectural ornament. Some of the colour and texture of his designs are closer to the colour print pages of these paper buildings than the original edifices, many of which he'd not seen. The metallic paint patterning on his doors, for example, were derived from the Armenian church of Saint Jacques in Jerusalem, and these doors are aesthetically closer to the layered surface of Burgoyne's print the Church worked from than the materiality of the mother-of-pearl inlaid doors themselves that you see here on the right. This isolated half page of Persian ornament among Church's pages, on the top left here, with his accompanying page of pencil tracings, shows us one of his working methods. The page is from Auguste Rassenet's book on Persian ornament, published in 1869. The objects from which these flat patterns were derived had been exhibited in Paris that year, and the accompanying notes identifies both the objects and the names of the French collectors who owned them. Pascal Cost's Modern Monuments of Persia, another book in Church's library, was a key source for his knowledge of Persian architecture and the direct source for a number of his ornamented stencils in the court hall. Cost's illustrated many of the most significant palatial and religious buildings across Persia, especially those in historic Isfahan and in Tehran, the city that the Qajar dynasty was building into its new capital in the 19th century. Church derives a pattern for the inside of his arches in his court hall from an illustration of the principal entrance of the madrasa of Shah Hussein in Isfahan that you see here. From another illustration of this same Islamic religious teaching institution, Church derives the decoration for the spandrel of his arches, amalgamating the geometry of the lower arch with the floral ornament of the top one. The structural logic of this focal point in Church's court hall, with its symmetrically framed open recess, resonates with the throne pavilion in the Shah's Tehran palace that is also illustrated in Kost's book. But in Church's stairwell, there are none of the signs of Persian kingship. The dozens of drawings Church generated shows how seriously he took his task of translating a whole range of sources into his orientalist architecture. There are dense concentrations of a few key features. In particular, he experiments over and over again with fireplaces and staircases. One of Church's drawings that you see here reveals that his reference point for creating the ornamental staircase was a minbar, the freestanding stepped mosque pulpit from which the imam delivers the Friday sermon. Along with the mihrab, which marks the direction of Mecca, the minbar is the key part of the furnishing on the Qibla wall in any mosque, but it's usually one of the most finely crafted elements of mosque furnishings. Church owned photographs of the minbar in the Mosque of Sultan Hassan in Cairo and the Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem, and these are photographs from his own collection that you see here. His sketch renders the minbar from different vantage points to highlight its various ornamental features. The religious context is suggested through the inclusion of a man at prayer beside one of them. The Church's overriding preoccupation with structure and ornament comes to the fore, where he labours the smallest of his minbars, simply stairs. In another drawing on the left here, Church proposes to include an ornamental frame on the central horizontal landing of his staircase. It's similar to that which often caps the doorway at the front of a minbar. Church entertained many different designs for the balustrades of his stairway. He eventually decided upon a geometric design with multiple faceted edges, and thus patterning is created by the light that falls on the varied angles of its timbered surfaces. These effects are augmented by the brass fittings, as for example with the finial that caps the balustrade on the lower stairs that you see here on the right. On the underside of his staircase, Church created a geometric star and cross design, akin to Persian tile work, through contrasting directional placement of interlocking timber pieces. The aesthetic effect works with the material properties of the timber grain, which absorbs and reflects light to differing degrees, depending on its angle of orientation to the room's ambient light. Church's use of timber to baffle, reflect, and silhouette light is influenced by mashrabiyah, Egyptian lattice screens. He had seen them on his travels and had photographs of them, such as the one that you see here on the left. One of his preliminary drawings indicates that he was planning to incorporate the beads and pegs of the basic mashrabiyah form into his balustrade. In the end, Church opted for a simpler form, but it's one that creates similar effects of light and shade. The perforated balustrade is one element within a multi-layered optical effect. As one moves up or down this darkened stairway, subtle patterns appear and recede. The stairwell's patterned carpet provides an ornamental counterbalance to the star pattern in timber on the underside of the stairway on the opposite side. The gilding of the damascened helmets, shield, and ceremonial maces in the trophy of arms glint in this low-lit part of the court hall, as do the brass inlaid highlights on the balustrade above. This balustrade is silhouetted against the golden light and dense patterning of a cut paper window behind. The amber-filtered light from this window above colours parts of the stairwell, while a soft light cascades in from the opposite direction from the aperture opening out to the Hudson. Objects and pattern are animated by these ornamental plays of light that reconfigure as the visitor moves. Originally, the jewelled effect of the brass ornamentation that is dispersed around Church's stairway was enhanced by painted metallic highlights. Some of them are still visible, as for example with the bosses on the capitals. Others, such as the edging around the niche under the stairway, have dulled significantly over time. The effect of this entropy is to isolate elements that were previously embedded within a dense matrix of patterning. The decorative balance has also been disrupted by the removal of the carpet on the stairs, a requirement of contemporary museology, when the second floor was opened to visitation. And I understand from Will that plans are underway to recreate these carpets, and they will in fact be installed, I understand, within about a month, which is fantastic. In 1967, artist Dan Flavin admired the complex optics of Church's Orientalist interior, but gave an impassioned response when he saw its compromised condition. Observing the house over half a century after Church's death in a state, and I quote, between decay and restoration, a dull state. So much of this work is distorted because of alterations, such as those to the windows and the loss of tinted glass. Also, the abundance of polychrome detail, especially on the exterior, is either painted out or severely weathered to relative loss. Household fittings seem to be depleted. The high sense of exotic artifice, which I had wanted to feel, is no longer present in and out of the building. Seeing the house prior to its restoration, Flavin had to imagine Church's Persian world on the Hudson because its remnants only provided a melancholy response. He declared that Church should have destroyed it. If I were Church, I would have had my atmosphere broken and dispersed, and my house burned to the ground. Its integrity must have been that important to the man. Now what remains to be adjusted, played with, altered, distorted, towards some insufficient antiquarian result. This is an impassioned response. Not all would agree with this diagnostic that when we go to Olana, we're visiting an aesthetic corpse, but it signals the intensity of a spatial poetics in which Church's Persian interior that has been at least partially eclipsed over time. Let's return to our three sightlines. In the first, the thread of the Petra journey is diffused as it's optically incorporated into Olana, the treasure house. With the court hall sightline, the panoramic view of the Hudson from the ombra is met by the exotic artifice of the stairway. Objects are incorporated as ornament in a space infused by carefully staged transitions between optical effects of filtering, reflecting, and shimmering light gathered from the Hudson. But it's a fragile effect. Quite another experience awaits us upstairs in the third of my sightlines. Whereas light subtly animates the objects and ornament it touches in the apex of the court hall, in the guest bedroom upstairs, light interrupts vision at the focal point of this room's sightline. Ornament is comparatively spare in this bedroom, and attention is thus drawn to the tiled fireplace across from the wall opening to the Hudson. When outside light floods this room, the shine it creates makes it impossible to see all of the profuse detail beneath the highly glazed surface of these Qajar tiles. To see the whole, we have to come at it from an oblique angle. It's hard to photograph. The challenge of seeing these details under Hudson light is congruent with an object that partially escapes our gaze because it only exists in this room as a fragment. Following its object networks recenters us in a different world, the world of one of Church's creative contemporaries, Persian craftsman Ali Muhammad Isfahani of Tehran. This fireplace is a union of diverse elements. The teakwood borders carved by Indian artisans in Lockwood de Forest's workshop in Ahmedabad were designed to stitch together divergent contemporary Persian tiles in the side panels and the central surround of this fireplace. The side panels are border tiles bookended by cartouches, and I show you one of them on the left, with Persian inscriptions. For those who couldn't read them, they're simply ornamental. They may not have even recognised that the top two tiles are upside down. For whom it is legible, the text announces a patronage network within the Qajar court in Tehran, and it does so insistently because the same inscription appears in all four tiles. It declares that they were ordered by the confidant of His Imperial Majesty, Monsieur le Maire, Chief Music Master of the Iranian government. And this text cues us to a world governed by a different measure of time, with the inscribed date of 1302, the Hijri calendar, which is 1884 to 5 in the Gregorian calendar. This Monsieur le Maire, inscribed on our Olana tiles, is Alfred Jean de Baptiste le Maire, a man who spent much of his career in Persia as chief musician to Nasr ad-Din Shah's court. And on the left-hand side, you see an illustration in the Illustrated London News of the Shah, Nasr ad-Din Shah. He trained Monsieur le Maire trained Persian musicians at the Dar al-Funun and was commissioned to ventriloquize modern Persian nationalism when he penned the first Persian national anthem that was played during the Shah's European visits. These border tiles at Olana are part of a family of tiles which includes a fireplace surround in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and you see the pieces of that on the top right-hand side here. Both had the cartouche inscription tiles declaring Le Maire's patronage, but the V&A surround has another inscription with the name of the ceramicist, Ali Muhammad Isfahani, and the location of his workshop, at the gate of Shahzadeh Abdulazim in Isfahan. This fireplace surround was purchased for the South Kensington collection at the 1889 Paris International Exposition at the Persian court. Like Le Maire, Isfahani was commissioned to bolster Persian nationalism through commissions for Nasr ad-Din Shah's palaces and other buildings created as part of the energetic remaking of Tehran into a modern Persian capital. The Qajar dynasty bolstered its legitimacy by embracing earlier Persian kingship traditions, especially the Safavids. The work of Isfahani and his peers exemplifies this modern Persian historicizing impulse through picture tiles drawn from the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. There were many Persian ceramicists producing such historicizing tiles. Like Church's modern Persian carpets, the Persian ceramics in his home were produced for commercial export. It was a pattern of trade that the Shah encouraged in very practical ways, including a gift of contemporary carpets to the South Kensington Museum in the 1880s, and through his support for the Persian Pavilion at the Paris Exposition in 1889. A substantial amount of the ceramic tiles and vessels produced in Ali Muhammad Isfahani's Tehran workshop were sold abroad through global diplomatic and economic networks. Consequently, the foreign owners of his work constitutes a who's who of diplomats, collectors, and artists. In Britain, Robert Murdoch Smith was a significant supporter of Isfahani. He wrote about the talented young Persian ceramicist, seeing the old artistic feeling in his work, concluding that although the ceramic art in Persia has long been in a state of degeneration and decay, a rival seems not altogether improbable. The formation of the South Kensington Museum's outstanding collection of Persian ceramics in this period was largely due to Smith's work. He was moonlighting as a purchaser for the museum during his appointment as director of the office of the Indo-European Telegraph Department in Tehran. This office was a key node in the British Empire's global communications infrastructure. Thus, Persia was incorporated within the dance of international diplomacy in the Near East, by which Britain maintained its vast global empire. And what I'm showing you here on the left is Isfahani's tile that incorporates Robert Murdoch Smith's portrait within it. It's unclear whether or not Church knew any of this. He may not have even known that the name of the Persian ceramicist that appeared in his studio fireplace. Invoices show that Church purchased through Prevost, a New York dealer who had a base in Syria, but on Church's receipts, they're listed only as Persian tiles. The most promising evidence of Church's potential knowledge of Ali Muhammad Isfahani is his connection to the Metropolitan Museum and the Safavid tile panel on display there that was the source of the figurative scene on Church's studio fireplace. And this is on the left, that panel, and you can see it's copied in the central panel of the fireplace. Farshid Imami's wonderful recent talk in the Olana lecture series provided important new connections, but it still remains inconclusive how much Church knew about his contemporary Persian tiles. Murdoch Smith's writings are another possible source. His 1876 book on Persian art is in Church's library, but it wasn't until a later publication of 1896 that Murdoch Smith wrote about Ali Muhammad Isfahani. The top left inscription on the upstairs fireplace is disfigured by a large crack. So too the top right tile on the central panel. These marks of damage in transit cue us belatedly to the centre of Isfahani's world and the numerous contemporary ceramic workshops in Tehran. The fireplace in Church's studio downstairs has more specific historicist references, with its inscription cartouches naming the Safavid Shah Abbas and one of the Qajar picture tiles hung in the corridor leading to the studio depicts an encounter between lovers, Sasanian King Khusro II and Shirin from the Shahnameh and Nizami's Kamseh. But in Church's home, this modern Persian visual historicism is severed from context, becoming illegible ornament for most visitors. These Qajar tiles take us to a network of objects and artists that only come into view if our art historical frames move beyond the Hudson and Church's foundational place in a history of North American art to encompass a larger international geography. They require us to insert Church's Orientalist narrative within an account of dynastic patronage in the modern Muslim world, in which the Qajar Shahs and their cosmopolitan elites determined modern aesthetic languages and systems of art value. And this broader frame of reference of 19th century global contemporaneity encompasses the narrative of the international, could we say global ambitions of a contemporary Persian ceramicist. Today I've been making the case that for Church, his interior was not simply a collector's cabinet of travel souvenirs, nor was his home simply a pastiche of imported styles. Rather, this reciprocal enfolding of Church's American landscape within the optical effects of his Orientalist interior is the promise of regional Orientalism. It's a cosmopolitan urge to see and be seen as a local citizen of the world that is embedded in a transatlantic dialogue. I venture to suggest the complex optics of Church's Orientalism is not visible to us for two reasons. Firstly, because of the entropy of some of Church's materials that dulled his exotic interior, the fragile ecology of his Orientalism. That is to say, the full luminosity of Church's original optical effects, their shine brought to life each day with the rhythms of the natural world. Secondly, because of the enduring legacy of national frames of reference for writing the history of art that have severed our understanding of the power of Church's cosmopolitan aesthetic. Its complex entanglement with the project of creating local claims on this land, which diverts us from recognising the relationships of Church landscaping on the Hudson to his project of creating a Persian interior. Perhaps it's time to reinscribe the full complexity of the architecturing back into Church's project of landscape architecturing. Furthermore, to grasp this interior as one that contains both details and fragments is to understand Church's practice of worlding as containing within it metonymic relationships to other worlds. The shine on the fireplace upstairs also cues us to art historical fragments that are not reconciled in the American landscape. It marks where our efforts to assay the grammar of this American Orientalism must be put in conversation with histories of modern Islamic art, with the practices of state making and art making developing across the Middle East in the 19th century that constitute other logics of worlding. It's an art historical gambit seeking to traverse the frontiers of our subfields. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Roberts, for that really helpful, even unexpectedly moving lecture because of the ways it is a product of a kind of slow looking that we simply can't do right now. So I found that very helpful. It shows the time you've spent looking closely at a place that means a lot to many of us, finding things in it that even those who work there every day have not seen, patterns, relationships, connections, and it makes me want all the more to be able to welcome people back in for the kind of extended immersion that you have clearly enjoyed in this complex artist environment. I have some questions. I hope that other people will have questions too. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Pop them in there and we'll do our best to get to all of them. I also just want to thank everyone for joining us today. More good things ahead this fall and into the future. We're taking full advantage of this relatively new technology to be able to engage with scholars, experts, interesting voices that relate to this really interesting place from all over the world, and we'll try to keep that going. Please do consider joining us as a member if you haven't done so already at olana.org/membership. So some of my responses to that, I was fascinated by that kind of phenomenological, slow process through this place, looking at the kinds of messages it's imparting. It's really helpful to see how you have thought about the kinds of framing that are happening in the landscape as well as in the house, the way in which this is not neutral, the way it is guiding your eye and conveying certain very explicit messages. The point at which you ended is really resonant and productive, because those of us who work on the Hudson River School are constantly militating against regionalism. And you have given us a really interesting counter argument. We find that there is a risk that when we talk about global artists like Frederic Church, national artists like Albert Bierstadt, and so many others, we limit them by talking about them as merely regional in the Hudson River School, in this this place where you're reinscribing it. So I don't know if I have a question there. I'd be interested to hear what value you think that regional category, that unavoidable category is, that has such wide recognition by our audience, in understanding Frederic Church as a regional orientalist.
I think it's a really, thank you for the question, and for this chance to really meditate over some of these challenges. Regional Orientalism is something that is really important for us to reckon with, I think, in relation to national histories of art. And Holly Edwards' wonderful catalogue on American Orientalism really opened out this potential for a conversation around in the context of American art. But we're also seeing the same thing emerging with Polish Orientalism, with Danish Orientalism, with Australian Orientalism in my context. And it really is about reckoning not just with the kind of knowledges that these travellers had, these cosmopolitan figures, and how that inflected how they approached their own local context. So it seems to me it's important that we assay the international context, but also bring it into conversation with the very particular challenges and cultural understandings as these things are translated into a local context. And that's something, look, in terms of the context of Olana too, I mean, my first subtitle was actually Land Claims. And I think this is really significant as we reckon not just with an American tradition of landscape, but also with prior Indigenous ownership of that land and occupation of that land. And this is certainly something that the Australian art histories are trying to grapple with in terms of Indigenous cultures and that continuing relationship to the land. So I think we have a number of different directions that we need to kind of work when we're thinking about this extremely international project, but also a deeply local and regional one.
Absolutely. And we appreciate you nudging us along slowly but surely in these productive directions. And you'll be glad to hear that we are actively engaging with the Indigenous history of our region, and a future event in this series will indeed bring in a representative of the historic owners of this land, and will help us to understand its much longer history of meaning, of even representation. So that will be a great help to all of us. Another question I wanted to be sure to get in before I open up to others is the thing you will have guessed that I wanted to ask about, because I first encountered it in a post you made on Instagram, that really incendiary, fascinating Dan Flavin comment. So I had a question also from our board members, Karen Zukowski, who wanted to hear more about that. You've given us some useful terms here. You said it does not strike you as a place of pastiche. The word that he comes to is antiquarianism, which is a front. I'd be curious to hear how useful you find that term in describing this place in relation to some other options. The one I threw out in response to you on Instagram was eclecticism with a capital E. That is a whole way of thinking, a way of knowing, might offer some other solutions. What value do you find in Flavin's characterization of it as an antiquarian exercise, a failed antiquarian exercise?
I think it's interesting because for me, that quote, I have such an ambivalent relationship to that approach to Olana, because of course, you know, we're all very glad it's there. And within the study of Orientalism, there is no other more intact archive that I know of. To have to have the travellers' costumes, to have their large corpus of photograph, to have their book, their library. We have very few other where we can really begin to interrogate what this Orientalist practice is in all of its forms through the very materiality of those remnant objects. But the other side of that is also that I think what the reason why I'm interested in engaging with that quote is that as an artist, Dan Flavin got the artistic ambitions of that project. And the quote actually draws very dramatically to our attention that there was a series of optical effects that he was creating. Mm-hmm. And I think that can sometimes get lost when we look at these Victorian interiors, sometimes with the sort of depleted surfaces that are the marks of age and the patina of time on the objects themselves. We can lose sight of that. So for me, I actually wanted to engage with that for that reason. And I think, look, antiquarianism, it's not, in some ways, it's something that you as custodians of that house have had to grapple with in very practical ways. How to actually restore, how to make it accessible to visitors, you know, the removal of the carpet, the reinstallment of it. You know, with each of those moves, when you put the new carpet back in, it won't be carpet that has the kind of age value of an old Persian carpet, but it will actually be something more practical. And look, it's been so important to me to talk with Chris, who was involved with also the architectural ornamental restoration of Olana, and to realise that there's a whole question here about practicality and compromise. And yes, at the end of the day, some of it will be still compromised, but I think it's very important that it's also there, because it challenges us to also think about the difference and the distance between our moment and Church's moment. And that when we're thinking about all these questions of cultural appropriation, of the turning of religious architecture and so forth over into a secular domestic architecture, all of that cultural complexity is about marking some of those distances and differences between us and them. And I think that with the interior itself, these marks of age and of time passing are cues to some of that.
That makes a great deal of sense. I have a question from our president, Sean Sawyer. Do the sightlines you've talked about today, particularly in the court hall through the Alhambra, have a spiritual resonance in the context of post-Civil War fascination with the Holy Land?
Oh, that's fascinating. I think, look, I've been interrogating, this is something I've been talking with Holly Edwards about for some time. The whole question of the religious resonances of American Orientalism, because of course she so beautifully drew our attention to all of that and the ways in which that changes across time. One of the things that interests me about Church's house, even though he's a deeply religious man and the travel is cast very much in terms of a pilgrimage, I don't see in that particular sightline so much of a set of religious resonances. I actually see it as a more aestheticist kind of project that is interested in creating certain kind of optical effects through the layering and the dazzling. I don't see it, there's no, to my mind anyway, and I'd be interested to know if others have a counter view, I don't necessarily see it as actually having a set of religious resonances.
I see. I see a question from my friend Professor Kailani Polzak of Williams and University of California, Santa Cruz. She's intrigued by your deep engagement with visibility and the light of this particular region, because visibility and quote unquote Oriental light is a familiar trope. Do you see the particularities of light as a way to reframe the vocabulary of Orientalism?
Beautifully put. I think it is true, because at the heartland of any conversation around Orientalism is that travellers went to the East in order to experience a particular kind of light and colour. But I'm really interested in regionalising that too. For the Australian artists, if you don't mind my diverging for a moment, their great journey to the heartland of empire, their sense of home, to London was via the Middle East. You know, our great national landscape painter, Streeton, actually traveled to Egypt. And what he saw there was not a light that he actually experienced as something necessarily different, but as something that he saw as quite similar to the bleaching light characteristic of an Australian landscape. So here too, whereas for artists traveling from Northern Europe, the experience of light is an intensely different one. So I do think we need both to register that there's different kinds of light across the Near East region. I mean, the light of Istanbul is very different to the light of Cairo and other parts of North Africa, but also to recognize that is a dialogue as well that will relate for different artists to their own contexts and their own phenomenologies of experience. And that then sort of taps into a kind of rhetoric around nationality. Yeah.
A question from Olivia Clemens, who really enjoyed this wonderful lecture. Could you talk about how churches collecting either fits into patterns or stands out from other artist collectors you've observed in researching your new book? I'll mention one case study while you gather your thoughts that's always fascinated me, a lost house that maybe Olana can help us understand better, the house of Jasper Francis Cropsey with this resonantly Orientalist name, Aladdin. And we wonder what it might have looked like, what it might have felt like, what patterns it might have used, and this possibility that there were many more places even in our immediate region that shared similar values.
Yeah, look, I think that is actually why it's so fascinating to look at churches' incredibly intact corpus, and I think it helps us then to potentially work to reconstruct some of these other lost interiors. One of the things I'm interested in my forthcoming book is actually engaging not just with Olana and its extremely rich corpus of material, but also in interiors in Istanbul themselves, Orientalist interiors by Ottomans and by British and other artists, Polish artists and so forth, and which are only known to us through remnants, say through photographs or through sketches in travel writing. And I'm really interested in the idea, in the case of one of the Polish artists I'm looking at, the idea of an epistolary interior, that we only really know about his interior in Istanbul through a whole slew of letters written in Polish to his family in Krakow. But that there's a really rich epistolary interior that's created through those letters, through the drawings, through the objects that he's describing, through his account of what he wants them to install, and that it's a dialogue of objects in that case where the objects are going both ways. So he's requesting that his family send him objects from Poland to Istanbul. So each of these interiors have their own remnant historical evidence, but they also are very distinctive kinds of places and interiors. And what I'm interested in is intersecting that with the history of modern Islamic art, because I think we shouldn't see this Orientalism as isolated from this history of modern Islamic art, because these collectors' interiors are crucial for the formation of the Victoria and Albert Museum's superb collection, the Louvre's collection, but also for the creation of very personal interiors and the articulations of notions of modernity for these artists who collected and displayed their work. Look, the other interior that's an obvious point of analogue with Olana is actually Frederic Leighton's interior. And one of the things I'm really interested in there is that they're part of the same network. In fact, we know that William Wright, the Irish missionary based in Damascus, is actually is visited by both Church and Leighton at different points, and he writes an article about the two of them. And it's an obvious point of connection when we look at those Damascus tiles in the ombre. And one of the things that interests me about Leighton's Arab Hall is the ways in which the tiles, it's completely encased. The skin of his Arab Hall is encased with these Arab tiles, 16th century and 17th century tiles, and they're glorious. They're from Damascus, they're from Iznik, and they're from Persia. But one of the things, this whole question of age value really plays differently. When in the Arab Hall, there's this wonderful sense that when those tiles are intact, they don't age. They feel ageless in that context. And that's quite different to Frederic Church's project of stenciling and painting his surfaces, which do age more quickly. and so I think this whole question of the sort of temporal resonances of these interiors make it a very interesting comparison between Leighton and Church.
You've anticipated a case study that occurred also to some of our questioners. I think you anticipated a question from Dr. Courtney Skipton-Long of the Yale Center for British Art. Thank you for your question, Courtney, as well as Cynthia Altman. So helpful to see those international connections. Professor Zerwat Chowdhury of UCLA has asked a really interesting question. She's struck that all the framings, the sight lines that we saw feature objects that seem to be aromatic ones. Incense burners, rosewater sprinklers, they seem to keep on going to that sense experience. Maybe I can stretch and also include another question I saw earlier from, let me see where it is. There was another about the senses here. I'm going to find it. Well, whatever. People were interested in the experience of the senses at Olana in general. So how would you respond to that? Are we looking at places that are appealing particularly to the aromatic? Is that a primary sphere of reference when the West looks east? Is that the primary association? I'm curious how you would respond to that.
Such a great question, and it's such fun to hear from Zerwat and Courtney and all of the other colleagues who I've been in dialogue about this material for some time. The emphasis on the aromatic, I like that. I mean, I haven't really pushed that as much as perhaps you're provoking me now to do, because I've been thinking about this relationship between a certain kind of physicality, an embodied experience, an intimate experience within that space, and an optical experience. But yes, I would say the aromatic sense experience, it's crucial to a kind of evocation of Orientalism. We often see it in paintings and so forth. And it is something that's food for thought is my response at this point. I will certainly give that more attention. And I'm curious now to know if any of the Brains Trust out here knows of the ways in which an aromatics might have been invoked by Church in his use of that space. I haven't encountered anything that describes that.
It looks like I may have not done full justice to Zerwat's really rich question, so she follows up to clarify. Let me see, I'll use her words instead of trying to sum it up. The entropy of optical effect that you mentioned is something worth considering, maybe in relation to the diffusion of sensory effects as well. Something that certainly comes up in antiquarian discourse about the bewildering incommensurability rather than summation of the senses, the relationality between the senses.
Yeah, I like that bewildering incommensurability, because I think that's something that I'm grappling with when I'm thinking about this notion of the shine. That there is at one level at which the shine is actually a kind of glorious part of the original optical effects of the building when we're looking at the original vision for the court hall, but that we're also looking at the ways in which the shine can also cue us to the incommensurability. And then, upstairs we're talking specifically about the incommensurability of the Persian contemporary ceramic context. That we're not sure how much Church knew, but also when we're thinking about the disruptive effects of the experience of travel, that it's not just about the Orientalist, the Western Orientalist self-assuredly kind of marching out into these lands, but it's also something that can be deeply challenging. And I love the way in which that the bewildering incommensurability is just a lovely way of summarizing this kind of connection between something that I'm trying to evoke here, between an optical plenitude or a sensory plenitude, and then something that is actually disrupting it, and that you might have one sense incommensurable with the other is certainly very thought-provoking. Thank you.
I think we're running out of time here, so maybe just one more question from our Director of Education, Carolyn Keogh. When we consider Church's creation as an inhabited space and not as a modern museum environment, do you see any overt connections between the sight lines you've outlined and the original function or use of the rooms in which they're situated? So we know about the use of the sitting room, the court hall, and that upstairs.
Yeah, look, I think that's such a great thing to ponder, isn't it? Because these are ultimately homes. And I think if we think back to Leighton's house, he had this, it was such a sort of manicured semi-public home in which he actually welcomed the public, whereas Olana has quite a different relationship to its public visibility. He did, of course, have some very famous visitors and guests, and it was written about, but not to the same extent. And I think it is interesting to think about the inhabited spaces. I guess first thing that comes to mind is actually that sitting room and the ways in which that experience of the light from the Hudson and even the visibility of the Bedouin themselves would actually change according to the time of day. That at night, the Bedouin would be more evident in a way that then recedes during the day. So I think thinking about those patterns of habitation, but also thinking about their relationship to an optical ambition and a set of aesthetic ambitions and sensory ambitions in creation of the home is intriguing, and one we could really think through in relation to a whole range of different, and I know that you have, because your guides and so forth are taking people through a home that takes us through the back quarters as well as to the main sort of display rooms and engaging us with those historic, those rooms and their grander aesthetic ambitions.
That's a good note on which to end, returning to that kind of gradual revelation of slow looking that you've practiced to such great effect, how these places change over the course of a day, how these were lived environments that required extended time scales to reveal their secrets. And while it is frustrating that we can't enjoy that extended contemplative time in the current environment in these interiors, you've helped us to remember all that lies in wait for the return of a broad public to Olana before long. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Roberts. Thank all of you for joining us. This will be tremendously helpful in all our work going forward.
Thank you for such a rich conversation. I'm very grateful.